Imagine the oldest companion people have ever had. Not the dog, not fire, though of course it's certainly a very important one. Not even the tax collector. No. Our closest companion is something far more personal because it's already inside the human brain. Hallucinations. They have followed humanity for tens of thousands of years, loyal as dogs, dangerous as fire, and as persistent as a tax collector. Wherever humans went across deserts, into caves, onto ships, into monasteries, laboratories, and psychiatric clinics, hallucinations politely came along. Whether they like it or not, they have also been extremely productive members of culture. From the very first cave paintings, where mysterious half human, half animal figures stared at us from stone walls, the human mind has been busy designing creatures that clearly never signed up for evolution. Somewhere in those flickering firelit caves, someone looked at the wall and thought, "You know what this rock needs? A man with antlers." And just like that, imagination or something very close to hallucination entered the historical record. Ancient mythology took the idea and ran with it enthusiastically. Greek myths alone contained enough impossible beings to populate several respectable nightmares. Gorgons with snake for hair, men with horse bodies, giants, monsters, gods who transform into animals whenever the plot becomes inconvenient. At some point, someone must have asked very reasonably, are we absolutely certain this all was just a product of our imagination? The visual art did not help calm the situation. Centuries later, painters began opening the same mysterious door in the human mind. One glance at the nightmarish creature of Hieronymus Bosch or the eerie vision of Francisco Goya, and it becomes clear that the brain possesses an alarming talent for producing images that look as if they arrived from a place slightly adjacent to reality. In their paintings, faces smell, demons whisper, strange creatures wander calmly through landscapes that should not logically contain them. And the most disturbing part, we all recognize them. Because the human mind never stopped doing this, not in medieval monasteries, not in Renaissance studios, not in classic books or modern cinema. Across art, literature, and whether we admit it or not, religion, hallucinations have remained one of humanity's most creative collaborators. They whisper monsters to painters, philosophical devils to novelists, and occasionally extremely unhelpful suggestions to insomniacs. From the shadows of prehistoric caves to the glowing screens of the 21st century, the human mind continues to invent, imagine, and sometimes even see astonishing things. Some of them beautiful, some of them profound, and some of them are so terrifying that we call them visions instead of hallucinations, just to avoid offending whoever might be lurking behind them. It sounds much more respectable that way. If hallucinations had a literary Olympics, Edgar Allan Poe would take gold, while Fyodor Dostoevsky would graciously accept silver, then write a 900-page philosophical novel explaining why the medals are meaningless, spiritually suspect, and secretly his anyway. And perhaps the most memorable example appears in The Brothers Karamazov, where a respectable intellectuals end up hosting the most uncomfortable house guest imaginable, the devil. Not a fiery monster, not a horned demon with a pitchfork. Dostoevsky's devil arrives looking like a tired, slightly shabby gentleman who might complain about the weather and his rheumatism. The unlucky host of this supernatural or psychological visit is Ivan Karamazov, the most psychologically tormented character in the novel. Ivan has been thinking very hard about God, morality, suffering, and whether the universe makes any sense. As it turns out, the overthinking is not a safe hobby. Think about these questions long enough, sleep very little, add a pinch of guilt and existential dread, and the brain might decide to produce a guest like this. Dostoevsky does something brilliant and terrifying here. The devil is not frightening in the traditional sense. He is polite, sarcastic, chatty, and unbearably smug. He gossips, he casually mocks Ivan's philosophical ideas. Imagine spending years constructing a grand theory about morality only for the devil himself to show up and say something like, yes, yes, very clever, but have you considered that you might simply be very wrong about all of it? The horror is not in horns and flames. The horror is that devil sounds suspiciously like Ivan's own thoughts. He knows Ivan's arguments, he finishes Ivan's sentences, he ridicules Ivan's beliefs with surgical precision. Which raises a very uncomfortable question. Is this the devil, or perhaps it is Ivan's own fractured consciousness? And here horror does not arrive in the guise of the devil at all. The true terror strikes when a person suddenly realizes that they might have gone mad, hopelessly, irreversibly, and forever losing touch with reality. Not knowing the truth, not being able to distinguish what is real from what is false, unable to perceive reality as everyone else does. That is the most terrifying hell a human can experience. A fractured consciousness is the real devil. In many horror stories, the monster hides in the dark, and we know they are there, because even more terrifying is when they are not really there at all, but exist only in our mind. From such monsters, there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Such monsters cannot be killed. But to make the nightmare unspeakably horrifying, Dostoevsky's monster sits in a chair and debates philosophy for 20 pages. By the end of these pages, it's pretty clear Ivan isn't being hunted by the devil, he's being hunted by hallucinations. And unfortunately for Ivan, those hallucinations are far more persistent than any supernatural visitor. The devil, after all, can leave, but your own thoughts, those come with the apartment. If Hallucinations had a favorite Russian author, they would probably nominate Nikolai Gogol for honorary membership. In his delightfully alarming story Diary of a Madman, reality quietly steps out for a moment, and hallucinations immediately pull up a chair, pour themselves tea, and begin running the narrative. And they do a magnificent job. Our hero, if that is the correct word, is Aksentий Ivanovich Paprishchin, a modest government clerk. His life is quite orderly and slightly miserable. He sharpens quills, copies documents, and dreams of impressing his boss's daughter. Everything is completely ordinary until one small detail appears. The dogs begin corresponding with each other, not barking, not howling, writing letters. Paprishchin, being a serious and attentive observer of the world, naturally decides the only reasonable course of action is to read their mail. And this is where the hallucinations begin to stretch their legs. At first, they behave politely. They introduce a small absurdity, letters written by dogs, and wait to see if anyone objects. Paprishchin does not. Encouraged, the hallucinations escalate. Days begin to behave strangely. The calendar becomes creative. Time bends. Logic wanders off to lay down. Soon Paprishchin reaches a completely reasonable conclusion. He is the king of Spain. Now, to be fair, hallucinations are very persuasive. Once they get started, they tend to speak with a great confidence. They rearrange reality with the calm authority of the bureaucrat stamping documents. Dog correspondence? Of course. Secret royal identity? Naturally. The Spanish throne awaiting a Russian clerk? Why not? Reality, meanwhile, stands quietly in the corner, smoking and looking deeply concerned. What makes Gogol so brilliant and so cruel is that the story begins as pure comedy. The reader laughs. The situation is ridiculous. A clerk reading canine correspondence is objectively funny. But hallucinations are patient creatures. They start as joke. Then they become convictions. Then suddenly the reader realizes something deeply uncomfortable. The world inside Paprishchin's head has become more real to him than the world outside. And by the time the story reaches its final pages, the laughter becomes quieter. Because the hallucinations are no longer playful. They have taken the throne. Paprishchin, king of Spain, finally arrives at his palace, which unfortunately looks suspiciously like a lunatic asylum. The doctor's rude men, with absolutely no respect for royal dignity, proceed to treat His Majesty in ways that are extremely unfit for a monarch. And suddenly the reader understands the most terrifying thing Gogol has done. The hallucinations were funny until they weren't. If hallucinations ever needed a professional workplace, they would immediately apply for a position in Morphine by Mikhail Bulgakov. The job description is perfect: a lonely provincial doctor, unlimited access to morphine, endless nights of the Russian north, existential dread, and absolutely no supervision. In other words, an ideal working environment for hallucinations. The story follows Dr. Polyakov, a young provincial physician who makes a small, seemingly harmless decision. He tries morphine once. At first, everything is wonderful. Pain disappears, anxiety melts away, life becomes warm, soft, and pleasantly manageable. Soon, the hallucinations begin their shift. At first, they behave like minor office assistants. A shadow moves where nothing should move, a sound appears where no one is speaking. Reality begins to feel slightly flexible. But morphine is generous. It doesn't just invite hallucinations, it gives them full administrative authority. The world bends, time becomes slippery, paranoia settles comfortably into the doctor's chair. And hallucinations, now fully employed, begin redecorating reality with disturbing enthusiasm. Here is where Bulgakov becomes truly cruel. Dr. Polyakov is not a fool. He is a doctor. He understands addiction. He understands the drug. He understands exactly what is happening to him. And yet, the syringe remains irresistible. This creates the most frightening relationship imaginable between a scientist, a doctor, an expert who knows exactly how hallucinations are born, and with the hallucinations themselves. The doctor knows they are lying. The hallucinations know he knows, but everyone politely continues the conversation. Morphine whispers just one more dose. The hallucinations nod approvingly. Reality quietly packs its suitcase. Unlike Gogol's absurd madness or Dostoevsky's philosophical devil, Bulgakov's hallucinations are clinical, efficient, methodical. They do not burst into the room, they arrive gradually like a hospital staff taking over a night shift. First, they dim the lights, then they rearrange perception. Finally, they take control of the entire ward. By the end of morphine, the reader realizes something deeply unsettling. The hallucinations were never a real villain. They were merely the final symptom. And like all good medical professionals, they arrived exactly when the disease was already too far gone. After shadows began moving independently, just like in Bram Stoker's Dracula, footsteps echoed where no one walked. Whispers appeared in the empty air. An inanimate object in his room seemed strangely alive. Once the furniture came to life, our hero moved on to people, or at least hallucinations of them. Naturally, in accordance with all the unspoken rules of the genre, these people vanished at the most inconvenient moment, precisely when Polyakov had fully convinced himself of their reality. Time itself began to behave oddly, jumping around, counting hours not only forward but backward. Space started to distort, and with it his own identity became unmoved, wobbling like a ship in a storm. When he attempted communications with living humans, their words seemed judgmental and mocking, and hallucinations appended sinister subtext to ordinary phrases: the fear of his morphine supply dwindling in the medical cabinet, his growing addiction, and his inability to refuse the drug. Then even his own memories began to rewrite themselves. His mind became astonishingly inventive, conjuring new scenarios that neatly absolved him of responsibility and guilt. By the end of the story, the doctor was utterly lost in a labyrinth of false memories, imaginary people, and an unflappable interlocutor who dictated what he should think and do. Logic has ceased to function. The facts it relied on had become contradictory and blurred, just like the boundary between the imagined and the real. It's all just the mind at play, sometimes mischievous little pranks, sometimes terrifying and irreversible deeds. But what if I told you that hallucinations aren't just the product of an overreactive, inflamed imagination? What if someone somewhere tried to photograph a hallucination? And what if he actually succeeded? The experiments of Soviet psychiatrist Gennady Krokhalев were dismissed as a hoax in the USSR and hailed as the discovery of the century in Japan. Krokhalov himself was patiently waiting for a Nobel Prize until he died under mysterious circumstances. Dr. Krokhalov lived in Perm in 1965 and worked in psychiatric clinic. In his free time, he pursued photography, delighting in capturing the nature of the Perm region as well as his friends and family. He was a deeply dedicated doctor, compassionate, driven, and eager to step beyond the familiar borders of psychiatry to understand the very nature of the hallucinations that tormented his patients. From the depths of his brilliant mind arose a remarkable idea. Beginning in 1973, he started experimenting with photographing his patients' hallucinations. The young psychiatrist believed that the human brain, when plunged into psychosis, projects the images it sees into the real world. And if that is true, then surely it might be possible to capture them on film. To actually catch his patients' hallucinations, he invented a contraption that connected the camera lens to a snorkeling mask with a corrugated hose. What did this produce? And did it work? The answer: definitely yes, but not always. The scientists conducted 229 experiments, of which 115 produced images. Some were heavily blurred, others surprisingly sharp, and a few captured shockingly precise visions. When patients came back to themselves after psychosis, they were astonished to recognize their own hallucinations in the photographs. Of course, the images were often fuzzy and indistinct, but every now and then faces, snakes, and animals could be discerned. The patients insisted they had truly seen all of it. Krokhalov believed that the images on photographic film appeared thanks to the brain's mysterious ability to emit infrared radiation into space. Indeed, the doctor mostly used infra 740 film for his experiments, which yield the clearest results. So, to anticipate the next question, infrared radiation is basically heat radiation. It can make things warm, be detected by cameras, and in Krokhalov's experiments, it was thought to capture brain emissions, and it is not radioactive in the dangerous sense we usually understand. But Krokhalov's ambitions went far beyond merely proving the hallucinations were real. He wanted to determine the exact frequency at which a patient emits their thoughts, and then using another device, a microlepton generator, neutralize them entirely. In other words, he wasn't just photographing hallucinations, he was planning to zap them out of existence, like a mad sci-fi psychiatrist with a snorkel mask and a plan to bring cosmic justice to the mind. First publications were fairly successful, and they were noticed and prized, but not by the Soviet Union. His articles were translated and published in Japan. In the USSR, however, Krokhalov's ideas failed to win favor. They rather awkwardly contradicted a central Marxist-Leninist principle, the primacy of matter. Krokhalov's experiments seemed to suggest quite the opposite, that thoughts, waves, and energy might come first. In the 1990s, armed with renewed enthusiasm and updated equipment, Krokhalov resumed his experiments with double the energy. With the new devices, he obtained new startling results, which he eagerly began sending to various research institutes. But instead of worldwide fame, something else found him: death. In April 1998, he was discovered dead at home. The official cause was suicide. His entire archive of research vanished from his office, and rumors about the strange and rather implausible circumstances of his death began circulating almost immediately after the funeral. Shortly before he died, Krokhalov had proudly told friends and colleagues that he was studying the influence of psychic energy on physical phenomena and was standing on the threshold of a discovery that would shake the world. Many argued that Krokhalov was simply a pseudoscientist. His experiments lacked control groups, blind testing, and proper accounting for technical factors, film exposure, defects, and other photographic mischief. Yet the question stubbornly remains: if he was merely a crank whose experiments collapsed under scrutiny, why eliminate him at all? Experiments like this reveal how the boundaries of knowledge expand. Many great ideas began as notions that seemed at first glance completely mad. Instead, more than 30 of his articles vanished from public access. His name quietly faded from the historical record. But why? Perhaps it is because someone was deeply afraid that we might discover a certain truth about the world and about ourselves, one that could completely and irrevocably transform our consciousness. So we came to a logical conclusion. Hallucinations have been humanity's longest running collaboration with the unknown. Sometimes they inspire art, sometimes they inspire religion, sometimes they inspire a man in perm to attach a camera to a snorkeling mask and attempt to photograph the content of the human mind. Because the same brain that invents poetry, paints angels, writes symphonies, and imagines entire worlds can also produce whispers in empty rooms, shadows that move when they shouldn't, and conversations with people who were never there. In other words, the most creative machine in the known universe, your brain, comes with absolutely no warranty. So, if you enjoyed today's journey into the strange, mysterious, and occasionally slightly unhinged corners of the human mind, give this video a like. It helps the channel survive encounters with both the algorithm and the supernatural. Subscribe if you'd like more stories with science, history, and the slightly creepy meat in the same dimly lit corridor. And most importantly, tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a hallucination? A strange sound, a moving shadow, a voice in the quiet, or a dream so vivid it refused to stay asleep. Don't worry, it's a safe place. After all, if hallucinations have been humanity's companion for tens of thousands of years, there's a very good chance they're watching this video with you right now. For lovers of Greek mythology and delightfully disturbing hallucinations, I warmly recommend my gripping horror thriller 3:13 a.m. I began writing it on a tiny island in the Indian Ocean, intoxicated by the wild nature and the blissful absence of the frantic real world, clearly the perfect conditions for imagining the apocalypse. The story follows psychic Ryman Lee, a man who sees the future and works for the government, predicting global disasters, terrorist attacks, and other cheerful little inconveniences. He is also regularly visited by the dead in his visions because apparently predicting doom wasn't quite stressful enough already. Then he begins seeing the end of the world itself. Realizing humanity's time may be running out, he teams up with a virologist and an anti-terrorism agent to investigate the possible causes of the coming catastrophe. It's perfect before sleep if you enjoy lying in bed casually spiraling into life and death questions at 2 a.m. and then dramatically sitting up every time the floor creaks like you are in a low-budget horror movie. The book has covered plenty of kind words on Amazon and you can download or read it on Kindle. The link is waiting just below this video. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Sincerely yours, Catherine G. Lurid.